Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk today about how people study the tea ceremony, the institutional side of it called the iemoto or family head system, and the effect of this family head system on the reception of traditional culture in Japan today, specifically as it relates to tea cuisine or kaiseki. So, I'm going to examine how the tea ceremony is taught, the institutional organization behind that, and the effect of that on our understanding of received traditions like tea cuisine, kaiseki. So first we'll delve into the process of learning tea. And what I have to say about tea is also true of many other traditional performing arts in Japan. Second, we'll look at the structure of these organizations called the family head or iemoto system, and then see how this all affects our understanding of Japanese culture with reference specifically to kaiseki cuisine. So when you learn something in the traditional arts in Japan, you learn by doing. You don't learn by abstract, and you learn by actually learning a song or learning the steps to a dance. You learn. You don't learn. You don't spend a lot of time learning scales so much. You learn pieces. I think we can see that in Suzuki method of studying string instruments. If you're familiar with that, students will learn how to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and other little short ditties on their instruments, and that way they can learn basic techniques. So rather than learn those techniques so much in an abstract setting, rather than learning scales and the like, initially children learn by doing, learning the process from start to finish. And I think that's a typical way of approaching lots of Japanese traditional arts. You learn by doing it, and you learn in a small way, and then you uh, take those small units and make something big from them. And those small units are called kata. And kata literally means form. And kata can be very simple. It can be a gesture. It can be a discrete movement, and you learn what these kata are. You learn the names for these kata, and you learn how to do them smoothly and gracefully. And so, if you study tea, you learn the various gestures and kata for that. And likewise, if you learn karate, you'll learn karate kata. Um, the thing about kata is it's not just a matter of doing the form, but doing it gracefully. Now, way back in the Warring States period, if you were to study the martial arts, the most important thing back then was learning how to kill somebody fast and efficiently. But over the centuries, when Japan entered the early modern period and a period of peace, grace became very important. Like how you did it. uh, can you move elegantly? And so if you study the Japanese martial arts, you know that it's not just enough to be able to punch somebody effectively. You have to do it in a graceful manner. And that's something that's very important for all katas, executing them smoothly, gracefully, proficiently. In no theater, there are kata. There are kata for the various dances, the steps. One, two steps forward, three steps back could be a kata. The basic movements of the actor, how they hold their body, that could be called a kata. Now, you've learned these kata, and these kata are building blocks for larger movements. In the case of no theater, you learn several kata for stepping forward, stepping back, making gestures, and you can put those kata together and learn to dance that way. And so they're little units you can plug in. And as you learn more kata, you can learn more complicated dances. Now, in the case of tea ceremony, your kata are helping build up your understanding of different tea procedures. These are different ways of making tea. And those differ if you're making thin tea, which is the typical tea when we think of matcha tea, uh, or there's a thick tea, which is Obviously, a thicker version, it's almost like a pea soup version that you have with more extensive tea ceremonies. Or you might learn special tea procedures to handle special objects. Sometimes the objects will be brought out on a stand, and you learn how to handle those. There's a temai for that. Or there's a temai for sitting at a Western style table and doing tea. So you learn kata first, you learn these basic movements, and then you put them together and you learn these temai and these tea procedures. So think of it as like the Suzuki child studying Suzuki. They learn a little tiny ditty song, and then they can make a bigger song later as their studies progress. And so the study of the way of tea is learning these different tea procedures and how to handle all these different objects, and it can be quite extensive, years and years of study to master them all. But to do that, in order to embark on those studies, usually you have to get a license. Now, an introductory license is rather inexpensive. It might just cost you $100. At least that's what it was 20 years ago when I got one. I'm sure it's a little more expensive these days. But there are many levels of licenses. As you learn more tea procedures, as you go up in the ranks, these licenses become more and more expensive. You can think of it as a pyramid scheme, right? The higher you get on the pyramid, the more expensive the license. So the final license could cost you $10,000 or more. But if you get that final license, then that qualifies you as a teacher. Or you could take an artistic name. You could take your tea name, your geime. So there's a ranking system for tea, just in the way, if you think of the martial arts, where you start off as a white belt and you progress your way up to a black belt. But you need to get a license to move up the hierarchy. Several licenses, actually. Have a drink of my sake. At the head of the hierarchy is the family head, the top teacher, the iemoto. Iemoto literally means family head. And 9 times out of 10, that person is a man. And so this is a patriarchal system, and it's a hereditary system. You don't get elected iemoto. You are iemoto by virtue of the fact that your father was iemoto and that you were born male. So here we have the retired iemoto of Urasenke Tea School, Sen Soshitsu the 15th. He's the 15th generation head of that school, or was before he retired. Almost all traditional arts that you can think of in Japan have iemoto. The exceptions are kabuki. Except in kabuki, there are music iemoto. So for shamisen, for instance, there's shamisen iemoto. But the actors themselves don't use that iemoto distinction, although kabuki is by and large, for the best actors, the top actors, a hereditary profession. Puppet theater doesn't have iemoto either. And if you ask the puppet actors, puppeteers, why that is, they'd say it's because it's too difficult. You can't always pass it on from father to son. I don't know if it's true or not, but you don't find iemoto in the puppet theater. Here are some arts with iemoto. Flower arrangements, certainly. There's many different schools of flower arrangement, and they have their iemoto. Kyogen comedy, which is the comedy that you see in between no plays. Medieval drama. No drama has its Kyogen comedy, and there are Kyogen iemoto. And then there are even iemoto of food. If one studies these medieval arts of cutting fish and fowl, called shikibocho, there are iemoto of that. So for example, in Kyoto, there's the Ikama school of cuisine, and there's also the Shijo school and others. So iemoto are ubiquitous for Japanese traditional arts of all sorts. What makes the iemoto so special? Well, the iemoto is special because they have a monopoly on the top knowledge of their school. They have access to any secret writings, but more importantly, they have access to secret oral secrets that their forebears have passed on to them. So this is stuff they don't share with other people. This is something that only perhaps one child per generation, one person will know. Those special bits of knowledge that outsiders can only guess at. But that knowledge is what proves the iemoto's authority. That's what establishes them as the top teacher. That's what makes them so powerful, is because they have the final, ultimate, highest knowledge of their school of performing arts. Um, and with that knowledge comes a great deal of authority. So iemoto has complete control over their art. They can decide who can be a teacher and who can be a student. If there are any materials that are related to studying that school, so for example, books about tea ceremony that the school issues, then the iemoto will get a percentage of that. And then in tea ceremony, the iemoto can also designate certain things as konomi, or signature goods. In other words, they can do product endorsements and say, hey, everybody, I really like this tea caddy here. Everyone should buy it. And in return for that endorsement, that product endorsement, they're able to get a small or sometimes a substantial sum of cash. So they were kind of the influencers of YouTube long before there was YouTube. This is something that goes back centuries in Japan, this idea of konomi and iemoto endorsing certain goods, and then students, if you want to be a good student, you need to buy those konomi that were associated with that particular iemoto. Here's some examples of what the iemoto can control in the case of No and Kyogen. So they set the repertoire of plays, and in No theater, there's about 200 or 300 plays that are staged, and that's it. There were thousands of plays written over the course of the centuries, but only 200 or 300 are staged typically today. And the iemoto decides what's part of the No canon. They're able to edit those plays down, change them any way they see fit. They're able to determine who has the rights to perform those plays, what costumes they can use, what stages, what masks they can use. So when I studied No theater in Kyoto with a family and they wanted to put on a play, and they were professional actors, they'd been for generations, they still had to go to Tokyo physically and ask the iemoto's permission for the right to stage a play and to use certain masks and costumes. They couldn't call iemoto on the phone. They couldn't send him a postcard. They had to go there physically and ask. And the iemoto would say, okay, you could do it. Or they'd say, no, you can't. Use something else. The iemoto can determine if a person can be a professional performer or not. And they can determine who can perform together. So it happens in the past that if the iemoto doesn't like you, they can take away your livelihood as a teacher and throw you out of the school. It's happened before. Iemoto in No, they also have their licensing system, and they get revenue from those licenses. And then any kind of media related to their school, any kind of pedagogical materials, they can enforce their use and then derive income from them. So if you want to buy a libretto to a play, even though the play itself is centuries old, if it's issued by the school, you have to use the school's version of the play, and the iemoto will get a cut of that revenue. So how does this affect creativity if you're an actor? Well, let me give you an example of what happens if you want to put on a new play. Now, as I said earlier, the repertoire of plays in No, it's 200-300 plays, but every once in a while, new plays are written for No and for Kyogen. And that happened not so long ago with a play called Mutsugoro, written for Kyogen. And if you don't know what a Mutsugoro is a mud skipper. These are little creatures that live by these tidal flats. They have them in Saga Prefecture, these muddy areas, and they jump up out of the water. And they're kind of like fish, but they're mud skippers. In Saga, they eat them. Never ate one myself, but they're a local delicacy. Anyway, there's this play called Mutsugoro, and it deals with uh, this golf course developer who wants to destroy the lands of the Mutsugoro. And the Mutsugoro spirits rise up and retaliate and try to put a stop to this. So it's a very topical play, deals with the environment, environmental degradation, and so forth. And it was allowed to be staged by the Shigeyama family, um, but there were stipulations about these new plays. You can't depart from the typical staging of a Kyogen play, and you have to use classical Japanese. You can't use the modern Japanese language when you stage one of these plays, and it can't become part of the repertoire. So these plays are offered on occasion, kind of as a one-off, performed a few times, and maybe will never be performed again. They're not going to be taken into the repertoire. And not everybody could do this. It's the fact that the actors involved were very famous, uh, well respected, came from very famous families that they were able to do this in the first place. If they were lesser Kyogen actors, they would never be able to get permission from their family head to do this. So on the one hand, the iemoto system preserves tradition because the iemoto is the final word of tradition. They have knowledge of all the traditions. They want to make sure that the traditions are maintained. And that's a very important thing for arts that date back centuries. But on the other hand, if you want to push against those traditions, if you want to expand those traditions, if you want to broaden the repertoire, then you might run into the conservative nature of the system, and it becomes a little bit more difficult to innovate. So how does this all relate to tea? Well, in tea, there are many different iemoto. The most famous claimed descent from Sen no Rikyu, a tea master who is the tea master for Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a warlord at the end of the 16th century. Rikyu is the founder of three lineages of tea, the Sen lineages, and he's associated today with this rustic style of tea. If you go back before Rikyu's time, the tea ceremony is rather a wild event. People were surrounded by all these gaudy items, Chinese vases, art, and tiger skins, and lots of sake drinking. But in Rikyu's time, things are more subdued, use of more less showy tea items, smaller tea rooms, dark tea rooms, very rustic tea rooms. So all those aesthetics that we associated with tea ceremonies today are often credited to Rikyu. However, there's a lot of mythology here more than history when it relates to Rikyu. And that's what I want to get into now. The mythology comes a century after Rikyu's lifetime. There were two texts published which really raised Rikyu's fame and prominence, but really have no direct historical connection to Rikyu himself. The first one was a collection of tea ceremonies that supposedly Rikyu had done, called Rikyu's 100 Teas, and that was published in 1680. And supposedly this lays out all the different tea ceremonies that Rikyu did, or at least 100 of them. Now, it's possible that this text was based on an earlier text, but we don't know what that earlier text was, and the latest scholarship shows that this was really something that's a product of the late 17th century, not Rikyu's lifetime. So if it was based on an earlier text, it was heavily revised. And so it's almost to the point you can't recover that earlier text. So it's really best thought of as something that's completely apocryphal. It has nothing to do with Rikyu. It just uses his name. And that's also true, maybe even more true, of another text called Nanpo's Record that was allegedly discovered, note the air quotes here, by a fellow named Tachibana Jitsuzan. And Tachibana Jitsu-san claimed to find this lost record by a disciple named Rikyu, whom nobody ever heard of before, called Nanpo. And Nampo's record is wonderful because it has all kinds of juicy stuff about Rikyu in there and how to put together a tea ceremony and his whole philosophy. But this is a fiction that was created in the late 17th or early 18th century. There's really no historical connection with Rikyu here. So it's a fantasy text, apocryphal text that was attributed to one of Rikyu's disciples. Yet it's one that's often cited when people talk about, Rikyu's philosophy of tea. People will turn to Nampo's record and find things in there and then highlight them. But really, it dates much later after Rikyu's lifetime. Why are these texts appearing a century after Rikyu's lifetime? Well, actually, if you look more widely in this period, there's all kinds of texts that are being rediscovered. And by rediscovered, I mean written. Because 17th century is really when the printing industry is taking off in Japan. People are looking for things to print. And it's when the iemoto system is developing in Japan too. So it's not just in tea. There are lost texts that are discovered for no theater as well, and other art forms, and these are being published. So it's really part of the trend of the times. But it's also part of a trend in tea ceremony because, well, it goes back to this particular master called Sen Sotan, who died in 1658. And he's really the one who, if you look on the chart there, he established the three Sen lineages, the three main schools of Sen tea, the Omote Senkei, the Ura Senkei, and Musashi no Koji Senkei. And so this is a time when the tea schools are coming together in the late part of the 17th century. And Rikyu's really coming to the fore because he's part of the ancestry that people are claiming. The reason why they're able to claim authority is because they claim authority from Rikyu. And remember, although they're maybe not making this explicit, they're saying, why do I have special authority? It's because of my descent from Rikyu and because of the secret knowledge that I have within my family. So this is a time period, late 17th century, when these tea schools are developing and coming forth. And this is also a time when Rikyu is being rediscovered and reinvented. However, let's do a reality check. These are not the only schools of tea around. There are more lavish schools than the wabi school. There's what we call daimyo tea, which focuses on a bit more of gaudy, a little more elevated. I'd say elevated is maybe not correct, but a little definitely more gaudy, I guess, style of tea. If you want to just kind of boil it down to something very specific. And then there's numerous other types of schools of tea out there besides the Sen schools. And that I mention that because these folks almost get omitted when we're talking about the school, about the history of the tea ceremony. Oftentimes people will just trace the history of tea ceremony through the lineages of the Sen families and ignore the fact that there's a lot of tea going on in the early modern period. There's even people who study tea outside of those schools. They purchase books, they study themselves. There are guidebooks to tea that women are using and other people are, townspeople are using to study something about tea outside of the formal structure of the tea schools. So that's going on as well. So just because, if you pick up a book about the history of tea and it just focuses on the Sen lineages, that's only one part of the story. It's a much more multi-dimensional, multifaceted world of tea in the early modern period. And even today, these tea schools still exist. So let's look and see how this affects our received knowledge of Japanese culture and look specifically at the tea ceremony. I said in a previous lecture how often Rikyu is credited with inventing the tea ceremony cuisine called kaiseki. And when you say kaiseki, kaiseki can really mean two things. Kaiseki can be the multi-course meal that you get at a very fancy Japanese restaurant, or kaiseki can be the tea, the meal that's served with the tea ceremony. So we have two different kinds of kaiseki today. And both of these, especially tea kaiseki, are often upheld as like the highest, ultimate artistic expression of Japanese cuisine. And oftentimes, the most refined version of kaiseki for the tea ceremony is what is called ichiju sansai, or one soup and three side dishes. So Rikyu is often credited with inventing tea cuisine. He's often credited with this idea of one soup and three side dishes as the ideal tea meal. Well, is that true or not? I need to have some sake before I get into this discussion. Junmai. Okay. Is he the founder of tea cuisine? Maybe you can see from the image what I think of that. But if we look at his tea records, well, you can get a lot of information from these apocryphal sources, Nanpo's record and Rikyu's 100 Teas, and definitely you get the idea from reading these texts that this notion of one soup and three side dishes is really important. However, if you actually are looking at the actual menus, the historic ones that we can accurately attribute to Rikyu, there's only about a dozen of these. And these don't just show this form of one soup and three side dishes. They show a lot of variety. And it's really kind of hard, based upon a very limited sample of 12 menus or so, to kind of get a sense of Rikyu as a chef. One historical source that we can use is the Matsuya tea record. Those records of Rikyu's tea are historically accurate. But the stuff we read about his way of tea food in Nanpo's record or Rikyu's 100 Teas, you really have to say that's more fiction than fact. And here's an example of a menu that he put together, and this is a historically accurate menu. This is from Matsuya Kaiki. This is from 1583, the 5th month, 19th day. And I used this menu before. It's one of the few ones that we have. And so you can get a sense for what he's serving here. He's offering the guests sea bream. He's offering fermented sea cucumber intestines, konowata, which is a delicacy. You may not have it much today, but it was delicacy back then. He's offering some kind of dengaku dish, and dengaku is a grilled dish with a sweet miso topping. This could be tofu dengaku. This could be eggplant dengaku. My guess is that it's tofu here. He offers a soup of greens and quail inside of it, and then rice would have been served. And then look at his sweets. He's got some kind of stuffed bun, Japanese nutmeg, roasted chestnuts, mushrooms, and a vegetable called arrowhead or kuai. That's not a bad meal. Maybe not so exciting for us today, but if we got it, we might enjoy it. Sea bream's not a bad fish. Dengaku's certainly tasty. It's not bad, you know. But let's look at some other menus that tea masters created over the years and do a little bit of comparison. And the person I like to compare him to is Endo Genkan. And Endo Genkan lived during this period of Rikyu revival in the late 17th century. Unlike Rikyu, we can't say much about his tea food. Endo Genkan was the first person to write a recipe collection specifically for the tea ceremony. So his book, Guide to Menus for the Tea Ceremony, is really the first book about tea cuisine, Chanoyu Kondate Shinan. He talks about a lot of stuff in this book. He talks about how to entertain a daimyo or a shogun, but he also provides these wonderful directions about how to uh, put together a meal for the tea ceremony. And what I'm going to say here is that I think Endo Genkan's tea food is a lot more exciting than Rikyu's. And if we're going to look for somebody, who's important to understanding how tea food developed, it would be Endo Genkan and not Rikyu. But wait a second, why do we know Rikyu and not Endo Genkan? Well, this has a lot to do with the iemoto system. And Endo Genkan is not part of the Sen lineage of tea. He's in a completely different lineage, one that's not so famous, and so not a lot of people know of his work and know his great contributions compared to Rikyu, who's famous because of apocryphal texts attributed to him. So I love reading Endo Genkan because he has all these funny things to say about wabi tea, the tea of Rikyu. And here's one of them from his book about tea menus. He writes, "In the past, things were quite simple. Brown rice, a traveler's soup with grilled salted sardines in it, served on a folksy wood tray. In those days, that style was interesting, so the tea ceremony became popular. Today, however, is a period when society is peacefully governed, people have grown fat around the middle, and the cooking of the past is conversely not thought to be appropriate to the tea of today." I think what he's saying here is that maybe wabi tea, simplicity, worked about a century ago, but people are too sophisticated these days, and this is a time of peace. We can live a little bit better than people did a century ago. Here he's offering a pointed critique specifically against wabi tea, and he tells us a story. There was a rustic or wabi tea practitioner whose name was well known in society, but he was fond of eccentric habits. One day he invited a high-level daimyo to tea, and on that occasion he served rice covered in soup, a grilled salt-cured fish on a small plate, and pickles served on a tray. And yes, there was a tendency in the 17th century to put soup on top of rice. You would never see that in Japan today, but that was something people did. But obviously, Endo Genkan is critiquing it here as kind of a rustic thing to do in a very negative sense. He continues writing, quote, "That daimyo became uneasy and wondered what was going on, but he did not say anything, and therefore he consumed his tea in a good mood, and the tea concluded. I attended that same tea gathering, and I thought how terrible it was to make someone eat something that looked like somebody's leftovers. Later I heard that the daimyo was furious. He was invited to tea again, but he never went back to that tea master's house." So here we have a very explicit critique of simple rustic wabi tea that pissed off a daimyo, and that again Genkan thought was absolutely ridiculous. Okay, so we've heard his critique of wabi tea. What did he do when he put together a tea menu? What was his idea for tea cuisine? Well, we can see. Here's one of his tea menus that he suggests for the 8th month of the year. So this would have been September, because we're in a lunar month. And so equivalent of our September. He offers the following meal: a simmered dish with a fried tofu purse. And here's a picture of one. It's a little tofu kind of layer of tofu that's been wrapped up to look like a little purse and has little goodies inside. Certain mushroom and akita bracken. So it's a little simmered dish with all those little things in it. He has a soup with grated yam, grilled green nori, spicy mustard. He's using barley instead of rice, which is interesting. And then he serves his guests a 2-tiered box. And on the top tier, there are pickled green beans and daikon, and the bottom tier has matsutake mushrooms and fried kombu. Sake is served. There's snacks, parboiled and pressed carrots, green perilla leaves, a soup of pickled apricots, nori, and arrowhead. And then he offers tea sweets at the end: grilled wheat gluten, shiitake mushrooms, simmered in herb broth, tea, and then persimmons later on. This is a vegetarian menu, but I think it's very evocative. I mean, I can almost see the different colors of it. The pickled green beans paired with the thin daikon, the tofu purse, which is a very elegant thing, served with Akita bracken, the grated yam, which is white color, with green nori and spicy mustard. So he's got a sense of color. He has a sense of taste, different types of tastes. It's vegetarian. It's very simple, but I think it's also very elegant and very provocative. And Endo Genkan, he writes that you can go to many different teas, but it's the food that people remember from these events. And I think his menu kind of stands out to me much more than Rikyu's menu, but maybe that's a matter of personal preference. So to recap things a little bit, iemoto are really um, synonymous with national culture before World War II. They're often trotted out as symbols of tradition, and after the Second World War, they're now seen as part of Japan's soft power cultural ambassadors. But their roles as the pinnacles of Japanese culture has kind of endured through the 20th century. So they play a very important role in preserving Japanese culture. But I think they certainly, if it comes to innovation, then that's a little bit more of a challenging. Uh, you have to wonder, maybe innovation is lost at the price of preserving tradition. Um, when it boils down to how you understand traditional Japanese culture, we have to be very careful not to see things through the lens of the iemoto system. I mean, however important it is, however ubiquitous it is, they're offering one perspective on Japanese culture, on one from the perspective of their school, when oftentimes there's other things going on that don't get mentioned because they're not part of their official narrative. Tea cuisine is a great example of that. If you read Sen school writings about tea cuisine, you're certainly going to read about Sen no Rikyu, but you won't read about Endo Genkan, even though I would say him having written the first cookbook related to tea cuisine, he made a much more important contribution to tea cuisine than Rikyu, at least the one that's historically very verifiable. So I hope that this has given you some understanding of the iemoto system and how it affects knowledge. If you want to learn a little bit more, you can look at these texts. I really recommend Christian Surak's Making Tea, Making Japan, Cultural Nationalism Practice. And then I've written about tea food in those publications. Anyway, I appreciate your attention. Hope you got something out of this lecture and look forward to seeing you next time. If you have questions, please do reach out to me. Thanks.